So I think about this spiritual journey from a psychological perspective a lot, because that's what I studied, and um, I think I've mentioned that I was going to pursue a PhD in a PsyD in psychology until this happened. Anyway, the interesting part about a lot of what I've experienced puts a lot of psychological disorders into a very interesting perspective. Because there's a lot of like overlap between crazy and spiritual. You gotta admit. Anyway, the like, what's interesting about it? Okay, so let's go straight to the deep end. Hold on your hats. Schizophrenia. Let's talk about schizophrenia for a second. So like, um, schizophrenia is the idea of like hearing things that aren't there, seeing things that aren't there, that type of thing. Um, and you can see the overlap between spirituality and schizophrenia. Dissociative identity or disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder, but dissociative identity, it's where so much trauma happens to a brain that it starts to fragment and crack open into sectors. Dissociative identities. But anyway, think about your horoscope. Think about your sun, your moon, your rising. Think about the personalities, the identities of each of those. Okay? Like think about your shadow self versus your other self, the little higher self on this shoulder and your little devil self on this side. It's been with us the whole time. I think what happens with psychology and like the DSM and diagnosing these things is like all of the things that we diagnose as disorders are only disorders because they're too much. But in moderation, in smaller, more manageable amounts, they're just what makes us all human. We all have the infrastructure to fragment into dissociative identities under the right circumstances. Under enough pressure, we can crack. And we would crack along similar lines where your host is your rising, and then you've got your sun, and then your moon, and then however many fragmentations have to happen in order for you to survive. Because like I was thinking about, like my other video I was talking about that, I'm kind of stepping into like my Leo season because I'm a Leo moon. And this has come up multiple times for me. And I've talked to other psychologists about this and they agree, like the ones that aren't staunchly atheist, it's like, it really is, depression is just an overly intense dark night of the soul that like you can't find your way out of. Does that make sense? ADHD is a form of looking for signs and synchronicities that is like gone a little too intense. There's too much data, like severities are different for all of this stuff. Sorry, I'm shivering, I'm cold. But anyway, I wanted to express that is part of like my scientific and psychological mind. How I make sense of a lot of this stuff is it's all like it all has to tie back to being natural, in the sense of like part of the natural systems, because for me that's the main tether to reality is like, does it follow natural laws? Does it follow the like the species selection, evolution, all those things, natural selection, all of it has to make sense in that lens, for it to make sense to me at all. Because everything has to be beneficial to the greater system in some way. And so the things that lead to, in the right environment or with enough trauma, the extreme forms of these things, like schizophrenia, like dissociative identity disorder, like autism, like ADHD, all that stuff. It's a hot take, so please don't come at me. But those are just the overly intensified form of something that comes naturally to all of us. We all have a touch of it. We all have the possibility of it. We all have the seed of those disorders within us. And it's just whether or not we're predisposed, meaning genetically inheriting the likelihood of those blossoming within us, or if we're in the right pressure cooker. It's like a recipe. Like, get a sprinkle of this, a sprinkle of generational trauma and some narcissism, and then you've got someone with, a high probability to limerence. Like, whatever it is. Fuck, I don't know. Anyway, but I do think that it's important to think about it that way, to me anyway, because I think it makes more sense as to also like how to kind of calibrate myself, because everything needs to be in moderation. And so it's like, you don't want to go off the deep end too much, because then you would wind up on the streets, unable to hold down a job, right? So it's like you have to kind of calibrate it back so that you're still tethered with reality, so that you're still making accommodations for the life that you actually have to live. Which brings me to another thought, but I'm going to stop here and make another video about that, because I want that to be its own thing again.